You walk into a Louis Vuitton store today, and before you even reach the counter, someone is already deciding whether you're worth serving. That's not paranoia. That's policy. Stand outside a flagship store on a busy Saturday, and you'll see staff at the door deciding, one by one, who gets let in and when. A private queue management system most retailers would never admit to, let alone build a whole storefront around. The bag in the window has no price tag you can negotiate. There are no sales here. Not this month, not ever. Louis Vuitton has never run a markdown in its modern history, and it doesn't need to. In 2025, Brand Finance valued the name at $129.9 billion, the single most valuable luxury brand on the planet, ahead of Hermes at $93.7 billion. It sits inside LVMH, a conglomerate that pulled in $80.8 billion in revenue that same year across more than 70 houses selling everything from champagne to hotels. Analysts think Louis Vuitton alone, just the bags, just the trunks, accounts for somewhere between $20 and $25 billion. $5 billion of that. Walk past enough Louis Vuitton stores in enough cities and you'll notice something else. There are more than 460 of them worldwide, and every single one is owned outright by the company. Not a franchise. Not a department store concession. Try to buy certain pieces and you'll run into a waiting list instead of a price tag. Limited runs sell out inside minutes online and resurface on the resale market at a markup, sometimes double the original retail. None of that happens by accident. It happens because the same company that sells you the bag also controls, completely, how many of them exist, who is allowed to sell them, and at what price. Louis Vuitton is not really a luggage company. It is an anti-counterfeiting technology company that happens to have trunks in it. Everything else, the canvas, the stores, the waiting lists, the refusal to ever discount, is downstream of one problem, solved over and over for 170 years. How do you stop people copying the one thing you sell? Now rewind. Before the name meant anything, it belonged to a 14-year-old boy with no money and no family connections, walking out of a village most people have never heard of. You are that boy in 1835. Anche, in the Jura Mountains, eastern France. Your mother is dead, your father has remarried, and there is nothing here for you. So you leave on foot and you don't stop until Paris, in roughly 470 kilometers, close to 300 miles. And it takes you the better part of 2 years picking up odd jobs to eat along the way. You arrive in 1807, 16 years old, with no trade and no trunk of your own. And that's the gap. A teenager who owned nothing in a city that already had trunk makers turned into the most valuable name in luxury. Keep that distance in your head. Everything in this video is the story of how it got closed. You spend the next stretch of your life the way most boxmakers' apprentices did, sweeping floors, learning to cut wood to the millimeter, watching a master decide what survives a 6-week carriage journey and what doesn't. In 1837, you're taken on by Romain Maréchal, one of the best packing case makers in Paris. The kind of craftsman rich families hired specifically to wrap and crate their belongings before a move. 16 years pass before you have your own name on a door. This is the part people skip, and it's the part that explains everything downstream. In the 40s and 50s, a trunk maker wasn't someone who sold luggage off a shelf. He was hired labor. Wealthy households employed a personal packer the way they employed a coachman, someone who came to the house, wrapped every gown and every piece of china by hand, and built a custom case around it. If it arrived broken, that was the packer's reputation, not the manufacturer's. Picture what the work actually looks like. You spend a day wrapping a single porcelain dinner service in layers of cloth and straw, then build a wooden case around it, board by board, until it fits the shape exactly, with no room for anything to shift over 300 miles of coach roads. Get the fit wrong by half an inch and the client's china arrives in pieces, and it's your name the household blames, not the coach builders. That's the entire training, 16 years of not being allowed to get it wrong. You learn this trade for 16 years before anyone trusts you with it unsupervised. In 1853, you get the job that changes your life. Empress Eugenie, wife of Napoleon III, appoints you her personal box maker and packer. That's not a sales contract. That's proximity. Every aristocratic household in Paris now knows your name because the Empress's own packer is standing in her dressing room. A year later, in 1854, you leave Maréchal, marry Clémence Émilie Pariot, and open your own workshop at 4 Rue Neuve des Capucines, blocks from the Place Vendôme. No factory, no investors. Just you, a lease, and a client list built entirely on word of mouth from one royal household. Here's the condition that made the timing work, and it has nothing to do with talent. France in the 1850s and 60s was rebuilding itself. Baron Haussmann was tearing down medieval Paris and rebuilding it in wide boulevards. Rail travel was replacing the stagecoach fast, and it was changing what a trunk needed to do. The old dome-topped trunks existed for a reason. Rounded lids shed rainwater when strapped to the roof of a stagecoach. Stack two of them and they don't sit flat. Put them in a train's baggage car and a rounded lid is dead space. Expensive, wasted, stackable for nobody. You see this before your competitors do. In 1858, you introduce a flat-topped trunk rectangular built for stacking, and you cover it in a gray canvas you developed yourself. The Trianon canvas. Waterproofed, lighter than leather, and it doesn't crack the way varnished leather does after a few thousand miles of vibration. It's plain gray. No pattern, not a single letter or initial anywhere on it. You are not yet famous enough to need a signature. That single decision, flat over round, canvas over leather, is the first pivot, and the commercial logic is blunt. The entire luxury travel trade is about to be rebuilt around trains, and almost nobody in Paris has redesigned their trunk for a train yet. You have a one-man workshop competing against houses with 3 or 4 times your staff and capital, and you've just made every rounded trunk in every rival's showroom a piece of obsolete furniture. 5 years after opening your own doors in 1899, you're big enough to need a real factory. You open a workshop in Asnières, just outside Paris, with roughly 20 workers cutting, gluing, and stitching trunks by hand. Standing in that half-built workshop in 1859, you could not have predicted that the same site would still be producing Louis Vuitton's most exclusive pieces 165 years later, with a museum built into it. 11 years after Asnières opens, the war arrives. In 1870, the Franco-Prussian War breaks out and Paris ends up under siege. Your Asnières workshop, the one you built with 20 workers, the one carrying your entire production capacity, is requisitioned. Soldiers move in and use it as a barracks. When the siege lifts in January 1871, you go back to find your equipment stolen, your tools gone, your staff scattered across France with nowhere to report to. 16 years of work, and the physical plant of your business no longer exists. Here's what the consensus view says you should do next. Rebuild small, rebuild cautious. You're 49 years old, you've just lost your equipment to a foreign army, and the safe move is to reopen at modest scale and let the reputation carry you while the capital slowly comes back. You do the opposite. Within months, you sign a lease on a much larger space at 1 Rue Scribe, directly across from the newly built Paris Opera and next door to the Grand Hotel, the single most expensive, most trafficked block in the city, packed with the wealthiest travelers in Europe checking in and out every week. On paper, it's an insane time to take on a bigger rent commitment. You have less capital than you did a decade ago, not more. It works because you're not pricing the decision the way a competitor would. A trunk maker on a side street depends on clients finding him by reputation, slowly, over months. A trunk maker with a shop front across from the Opera and the Grand Hotel gets his clientele delivered to him every night by a hotel that's already done the work of attracting them. You're not paying for square footage, you're paying for foot traffic that would otherwise cost years to build by hand. Here's why the bet was less reckless than it looks. The war could take your tools, it could take your stock. It could not take the fact that half of aristocratic Paris already knew your name from the Empress's dressing room 15 years earlier. That reputation was the one asset a Prussian requisition order couldn't touch. And it's the same asset, expressed differently, that shows up later in this story as a specific pattern woven into canvas. The workshop rebuilds too, and it doesn't just recover, it compounds. That 20-person crew from 1809 becomes a workforce of more than 100 by the turn of the century. Do the arithmetic on that because it's worth doing out loud. 20 people growing to just over 100 is roughly 5 times the headcount, spread across a little more than 40 years. That's a doubling in staff roughly every 15 years, not from a war chest, not from outside investors, but from a business a Prussian army had physically gutted less than a decade earlier. The physical plant keeps pace with the ambition. In the 1880s, the Asnières site gets an entirely new metal-framed workshop building, the kind of industrial construction more associated with railway stations than with a family trunk business. Another expensive bet on a craft that, on paper, a single war had already proven fragile. The pattern doesn't stop at Paris. By 1885, barely 14 years after soldiers were sleeping in your workshop, you send your own son to open Louis Vuitton's first shop outside France, at 289 Oxford Street, London. A foreign market, a foreign currency, a foreign customer base. at a moment when plenty of Parisian houses were still just trying to get back to where they'd been before the war. Every one of these moves shares the same shape. Take the biggest swing at the exact moment the balance sheet says you can least afford it. Skip ahead a generation because the company you're building forces a choice every growing luxury house eventually faces, and it's worth stopping the timeline to lay it out properly. Do you make everything yourself, or do you rent your name to people who'll make it for you? License the name and the math is seductive. You sign a contract, a manufacturer somewhere else pays you a royalty, typically a few percent of wholesale, sometimes a flat fee, and puts your name on shoes, watches, sunglasses, products you never touch and never inspect. No factory to build, no capital tied up in leather and buildings, just a signature and a check that arrives every quarter, and your name shows up in 100 countries in a fraction of the time it would take to build 100 stores. Pierre Cardin ran exactly this playbook further than anyone else in fashion history. By 1984, he had 540 licenses. 2 years later, in 1986, that number had passed 800, a jump of roughly 50% in 24 months, licenses on everything from cookware to orthopedic mattresses. The royalties were real money for years. Then it wasn't. Nobody controlling quality across 800 separate factories can guarantee any single one of them is worth wearing. The name stopped meaning expensive and started meaning everywhere, which in luxury is closer to a death sentence than a compliment. Business schools now teach it under its own name, cardinization. Own the factory instead, and the trade-off flips completely. Every workshop is capital you have to raise and carry on your own books. Every new country means either years of profit reinvested into a store you own outright, or you don't enter that country at all. Growth is slow, deliberately, but nobody 2 continents away can put your name on a product you've never seen, because there is no license to sign in the first place. Quality is not a contract term. It's whoever is standing at the workbench, and you know exactly who that is every time. This is the fork Louis Vuitton took, generation after generation, and it's still the choice today. Every one of the more than 460 stores carrying the name is company-owned. Not one franchise. Not one licensed factory making the bags under contract. Look at what owning the factory actually costs in the present tense. 18 separate ateliers in France alone employing close to 4,800 people, with roughly another 1,000 hired through the end of 2024. Another 1,600 employees across workshops in Spain. That's real capital, sunk into buildings and payroll on multiple continents, none of it recoverable the way a canceled license simply stops costing you money. Louis Vuitton isn't alone in making that bet either. Hermès runs the identical playbook. No licensing, production kept almost entirely in-house, and a waiting list for its most famous handbag that can run into years. 2 of the industry's most valuable names arriving at the same answer independently isn't a coincidence. It's evidence the fork is real. Neither answer is wrong. Licensing gets you everywhere fast and hands you a royalty check while somebody else carries the manufacturing risk. Owning the factory gets you total control and a name that still means something a century later. At the cost of growth, you have to fund yourself, one workshop at a time. Pick either one and you have just locked in how fast and how far that your name is allowed to travel for the rest of the company's life. Here's a thought experiment, and I want you to actually answer it before I do. 2 patterns, both printed on canvas, both sold by the same house, 8 years apart. Pattern 1 is a checkerboard, brown and tan squares, released in 1888, purely decorative, chosen because it looked expensive and was hard to mistake for anyone else's plain canvas. Pattern 2 is a set of interlocking initials, a 4-petal flower, and a quatrefoil released in 1896, designed by the founder's own son. Which of those 2 patterns is actually worth more? Read that again. Which of those 2 is worth more, the pattern that looks rich or the pattern that's hard to copy? Most people guess the checkerboard because it's the one that reads as luxury at a glance. They're wrong, and the reason tells you what this entire company actually is. By the 1880s, Louis Vuitton's canvas was popular enough that other workshops were copying it. Badly, but copying it and selling cheaper knockoffs to customers who couldn't tell the difference until the trunk fell apart on its first trip. The Damier checkerboard in 1888 was the first response. Distinctive enough to be harder to fake than plain gray canvas. It didn't fully work. Checkerboards, it turns out, are not that hard to copy. Louis died in 1892. His son, Georges, 34 years old, inherited a company that was famous enough to be a target and not yet protected enough to survive being one. In 1896, Georges drew a pattern nobody would think to copy for a different reason entirely. It wasn't just decorative, it was his own family's initials, interlocked, repeated across the whole canvas. Copying a checkerboard is easy. Openly manufacturing a counterfeit stamped with somebody else's actual family initials is a different kind of theft. More obviously, provably a fraud. The monogram wasn't a style choice. It was a legal and reputational tripwire built directly into the fabric. This is where the thesis pays off. Louis Vuitton was never really a luggage company. It's an anti-counterfeiting technology company that happens to have trunks and now handbags in it. The monogram was never primarily about looking good. It was about making theft self-evident. And here's the part that carries all the way to the present day. That same instinct, remove every opportunity for someone else to counterfeit, misrepresent, or dilute what you're selling, didn't stop at the canvas. It became the whole distribution strategy. Louis Vuitton sells through 0 department stores, 0 duty-free wholesalers, 0 franchise partners. Every one of its 460-plus stores is company-owned. There is no legitimate channel where a Louis Vuitton product changes hands wholesale at any point before it reaches a customer. Do the arithmetic on why that matters, because it's not sentimental, it's just money. Standard wholesale terms in luxury goods run close to a 50% cut. A brand selling through a department store typically nets around half of what the item retails for, with the retailer keeping the other half. If even half of Louis Vuitton's estimated $20 to $25 billion in annual sales went through wholesale partners at that standard cut instead of the brand's own stores, that's something like $5 to $6 billion a year handed permanently to somebody else's balance sheet. Instead, it stays inside the house. 0 wholesale isn't customer obsession. It's the 18/6 canvas wearing a different disguise. Control every point where a fake, a discount, or an unauthorized reseller could get between the house and the person paying full price. The 18/6 instinct is still on the payroll today, literally. Louis Vuitton's intellectual property department manages more than 18,000 registered trademarks, designs, and copyrights backed by roughly 250 agents worldwide, and an enforcement budget reported at $15 million a year. In 2010 alone, the house launched over 10,673 raids, about 43 a day, and more than 5,171 anti-counterfeiting procedures. By 2017, that annual procedure count had climbed past 38,000. In one single U.S. case, a court awarded Louis Vuitton $584 million in damages against a counterfeit operation. A single verdict larger than the entire annual revenue of most legitimate mid-sized companies, extracted from people who were never selling anything real in the first place. That is not a company protecting its feelings. That is the checkerboard and monogram instinct from 1888 and 18s running at industrial scale with its own budget line and its own lawyers. None of this made the company immune to everything. It only made it hard to copy. Being hard to copy and being impossible to kill are two very different things. And Louis Vuitton nearly found that out the hard way. Fast forward past 4 more generations into a boardroom fight that ends with none of the founding family left standing. In 1943, a steel tycoon named Henry Racamier marries Odile Vuitton, a great-granddaughter of the founder. It takes him another 34 years to actually run the company. In 1977, at 65 years old, Racamier becomes chairman of a business that, even by then, still counted just 2 stores in France and less than $10 million a year in sales. He spends the next decade turning that into a global retail machine, but blows. By 1987, Racamier is worried, correctly, that a company this valuable and this family-controlled is a prime target for a hostile buyer. So he does what looks, on paper, like a defensive masterstroke. He merges Louis Vuitton with Moet Hennessy, the group behind Dom Perignon and Hennessy Cognac, creating LVMH. The idea is safety and size, a bigger, harder-to-swallow company with the founding families still holding the majority of the stock between them. It backfires almost immediately. The two sides of the new merger can't agree on who's actually in charge, and Racamier, fighting Moet Hennessy's own chairman for control of the new group, brings in Bernard Arnault as an ally, a wealthy investor who seems happy to back Racamier's side of the fight. That turns out to be the single worst decision of Racamier's career. Arnault isn't there to back anyone. In July 1988, he partners with the Guinness Brewing Group and buys a 24% stake in LVMH. By late 1988, he's spent roughly another $600 million to push his position toward 38%. By 1989, he controls 43.5% of the shares, enough, combined with allied voting rights, to force his way into the chairmanship. Racamier, the man who invited Arnault in and engineered the merger specifically to prevent a takeover, is formally fired from the company in November 1989. That's the near death. Not bankruptcy, not a burned-down factory. The complete loss of the one thing that had defined the house for 5 generations, a Vuitton or a Vuitton by marriage at the top of it. The New York Times called it a corporate duel to the death, and they weren't exaggerating by much. What got cut wasn't a product line. It was the founding family's control over the name they'd spent 135 years building. What got sold, in effect, was Racamier's own seat, and what followed was years of lawsuits between him and Arnault, each side accusing the other of bad faith long after the boardroom fight itself was over. Within a few years, the board is remade entirely, and no member of the founding family holds an operating role at Louis Vuitton again, not then and not since. Here's the detail that makes it sting. Louis Vuitton wasn't the only serious trunk maker in 19th century Paris. It wasn't even the oldest. Moynat, founded in 1849, 5 years before Vuitton opened his own doors, built the same kind of reputation among the same kind of clientele using the same core craft. Moynat never got bought out by a corporate raider. It just slowly lost the fight against mass production, cheaper materials, and the death of hand-built travel goods as automobiles replaced private railcars. In 1976, after 127 years, Moynat closed for good. It stayed closed for 35 years. Reviving a dead luxury name takes exactly the kind of capital and infrastructure that only a conglomerate has. In 2010, Bernard Arnault's holding company bought what was left of the Moynat name, and in December 2011, it reopened as a boutique house under the LVMH umbrella. The same man who took Louis Vuitton away from its founding family in 1989 is the same man who, 21 years later, resurrected Louis Vuitton's own oldest rival from 35 years of nothing. Two trunk makers, same city, same craft, same era. One lost its family and kept its independence as a product. The other lost its family and kept nothing at all for 35 years until the exact company that ended the first one's independence decided the second one was worth reviving. Being hard to copy didn't save either of them from that. Only capital did. What Arnault did with control, once he had it, is arguably why the numbers from the start of this video exist at all. He ran a family maison like an asset class, expanding store count aggressively, acquiring or reviving rival houses instead of competing with them, and enforcing the no discount, no wholesale doctrine globally instead of market by market. The $129.9 billion valuation you saw in the opening is not really a Vuitton family achievement. It's an Arnault-era one, built on a company the family no longer controls. So, which version is true? The trunk maker from the Jura Mountains who built an empire through craftsmanship, or the conglomerate that bought a valuable name and ran the scarcity playbook harder than anyone else in the industry? Both are, and the company would rather you focus on the first one. The story Louis Vuitton tells you, in every campaign and every store fitting, is continuity. 5 generations. A workshop in Asnières that's been running more or less since 1859. A monogram designed by a son who wanted to protect his father's name. It's not fiction. Georges Vuitton was real. The war was real. The rebuild was real. The version the numbers support is colder. The founding family lost control of the company entirely in 1989, 4 generations short of the 5 the marketing implies. In a hostile takeover, the family's own defensive merger had made possible. The $129.9 billion brand from the opening sits inside a conglomerate of more than 70 houses run by a man with no blood relation to Louis Vuitton at all. The scarcity that makes the bags desirable isn't a happy accident of demand outpacing supply. It's manufactured deliberately by a company that owns every one of its 460-plus stores specifically, so nobody else can ever discount, wholesale, or flood the product the way a licensee flooded Pierre Cardin's name in the 1980s. That control costs something, and it's worth naming plainly. It cost the founding family their company. It created total dependence on one holding company's balance sheet and one chairman's judgment instead of a 5-generation family succession that, by the numbers, never made it past 4. And it means Louis Vuitton's fortunes now move with LVMH's. When the group's 2025 revenue slipped nearly 5% against a difficult global economy, Louis Vuitton slipped with it, no matter how tightly the canvas pattern is controlled. If you're ever the one building something with your own name on it, this is the part worth sitting with. The romantic version of this story is a family and a craft. The mechanism underneath it is a permanent, almost paranoid refusal to let anyone else touch the point of contact between the product and the customer. The packing, the pattern, the shopfront, the price? That refusal is expensive to maintain, and it is, on the evidence of 170 years, the only thing that has actually worked. Is the story repeatable? Not exactly, and not on purpose. You can't recreate an empress needing a personal packer in 1803 or a war destroying your only workshop in 1871, or a corporate raider circling at the exact moment your defensive merger falls apart. Those are accidents of timing, not a formula anyone could sit down and plan in advance. What you can copy is the instinct underneath all three. Identify the one thing that can be faked, copied, discounted, or diluted, and remove every route to doing it. A gray canvas trunk in 1804 had nothing to protect yet. 170 years later, the whole company is still built around the same defense. Louis Vuitton was never really in the luggage business. It was always in the business of making sure nobody could fake being Louis Vuitton. It still is.